The dawn of the 1930s worldwide economic depression brewed discontent among the civilian population in the Weimar Republic, forcing the country into political disarray after the government failed to enact recovery policies. President Hindenburg held fears of an imminent communist overthrow, the same fears that enabled Hitler's rise to chancellorship on January 30th, 1933. Thus, Hitler began the process of consolidating Nazi rule in Germany with the implementation of the party's racist beliefs. Despite widespread discrimination of marginalized groups around the world, even in nations like the United States, the extent to which the Third Reich escalated violations of minorities' rights called for an international intervention. From the point of Hitler's appointment to the end of World War II, many groups faced discrimination and unjust persecution. The targeted groups included Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and so-called asocials, people who compulsively engaged in socially distant behavior, which includes habitual or career criminals, and people unable to hold a job. Yet, above all, were Jews, who were deemed the priority enemy of the German peoples. All of these groups were seen as either inferior races to the pure Aryan Germans, threats to national security because they did not conform to the Nazi perceptions of social norms, or genetically degenerate and harmful influences on the hygiene of the Aryan race. From 1933 to 1939, the national government, as well as state, regional, and municipal officials, passed more than 400 decrees and regulations specifically against Jews, all of which restricted aspects of their public and private lives. And yet, these 400 decrees do not account for the many other laws that targeted other groups. Noteworthy instances include the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases, which mandated the forced sterilization of certain individuals with physical and mental disabilities, the 1935 German Ministry of Justice's revisions of the paragraphs 175 and 175A of the German Criminal Code, which facilitated the systematic persecution of men accused of homosexuality, and a 1936 order which directed authorities to enforce existing anti-Romani laws and to deport non-German Roma and Sinti.
Still, Jews face the most severe aspects of discrimination, as from 1933 to 1939, all Jewish rights were stripped. The infamous Nuremberg Laws, a collection of two laws, Law of the Reich Citizen and Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, as well as its many follow-up decrees, deprived Jewish communities of their legal statuses, excluded Jews from the practice of medicine, criminalized sexual relations and marriage between Jews and Germans, forbade Jews from employing female German maids under the age of 45, and most importantly, defined Jews in accordance with Nazi beliefs. Instead of them being people who follow Judaism, Nazis defined Jews as a member of a race and stated that Jews are those who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents, which enabled the Nazis to separate Jews from the rest to then persecute them with ease. These laws were at the forefront of Jewish discrimination and set the foundation for future legislation targeting this group, like the decree on the elimination of Jews from economic life, which restricted Jews from operating retail stores, sales agencies, and from carrying on a trade, as well as forbidding Jews from selling goods or services at an establishment of any kind. With widespread anti-Semitic sentiments through the laws that socially segregated Jews, a national wave of violence erupted in 1938, known as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. The event was orchestrated by Nazi officials and their sympathizers, who incited anti-Jewish pogroms where hundreds of synagogues were destroyed, around 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses and other commercial establishments were looted, and German cemeteries were desecrated. In a letter to the Department of State, American counsel Samuel Honecker encapsulated the tragedy perfectly, noting that the Jews of Southwest Germany have suffered vicissitudes during the last 3 days which would seem unreal to one living in an enlightened country during the 20th century if one had not actually been a witness to their dreadful experiences, or if one had not had them corroborated by more than one person of undoubted integrity. After the event and the tons of decrees that followed, many Jews concluded that there was no future for them in Nazi Germany. Even though 1933 to 1939 were Hitler's early years in a position of power, in just 6 years he had managed to limit the personal freedoms of almost all German citizens. But more significantly, he managed to dehumanize minority groups. He passed laws that segregated minorities from the Aryan race, and then denied them any basic rights. Minorities could not have children, could not own a business, could not receive medical treatment. They were treated with brutality and persecuted for their identities, beliefs, and acts. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning. During the pre-World War II era, the Nazis merely attempted to revoke any sympathy for minorities that the public may have held, and only after World War II started would Hitler unleash true horrors upon the marginalized. Across an entire ocean to the west, the United States was slowly recovering from the Great Depression. When World War II broke out, the national focus shifted towards neutrality, as economic instability and political reluctance prevented active intervention. Even as reports of Nazi atrocities reached the American shores, the press failed to provide extensive coverage of the Holocaust, and when waves of refugees hit the United States, strict immigration quotas, established a decade prior, severely limited migration. Not only that, but the United States struggled with its own prejudicial sentiments, especially towards African Americans and Jews. The presence of infamous societies like the KKK and segregationist legislation like the Jim Crow laws greatly limited African American liberties. As for the Jews, anti-Semitic leaders like Father Charles Collin, a radio priest, and William Dudley Pelley and his silver shirts began to influence American politicians with their fascist ideology and hatred for Jews which, coupled with already existing disdain for foreigners, caused many refugees who fled Nazi persecution to be turned away. Still, many outraged Jewish communities began to pressure their government, prompting the US and the UK to hold an emergency conference in Bermuda to develop a rescue plan. There, delegates were more concerned with what to do with the Jews once they successfully rescued them rather than devising a rescue plan. So when no progress or plan of aid was produced, the governments lied to the public, citing that significant progress was made. Such an ineffective approach to deal with genocide culminated in 2,772,000 Jews, 46% of Jewish victims being murdered at killing centers. The violations against human rights, which escalated from domestic segregation from all aspects of life and discrimination to the systematic genocide of minorities and Jews, showcased the deterioration of the sense of responsibility amongst the foreign and domestic civilians and governments. The German government completely relinquished all of its legal, social, and ethical responsibilities when the Nazi Party began implementing its policies, and the vast majority of the German people simply refused to go against the government. They ignored their ethical and social responsibilities in order to keep themselves largely safe from the dictatorship. The United States government and peoples were not much better, as their lack of aid and largely discriminatory attitudes, showcasing the abandonment of responsibility, enabled the Nazi regime to proceed with the Holocaust without hindrance. Only when the nation was threatened would the United States join an international coalition against the Nazi regime, which would bring about the end of World War II. With the war over and the oppressed groups liberated, the Allies wished to restore the lost responsibilities of the government and people, as well as the rights of the marginalized. Representatives from the United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and France signed an agreement on August 8, 1945, which included a charter for an international military tribunal to conduct trials for major Axis war criminals. The indictment lodged against them contained 4 counts: crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and a common plan or conspiracy to commit the criminal acts listed in the 3 counts.
Starting on November 20th, 1945, a total of 216 court sessions were held until October 1st, 1946, when the verdict on 22 of the original 24 defendants was handed down. 2 were excluded, 3 were acquitted, 4 were sentenced to terms of imprisonment ranging from 10 to 20 years, 3 were sentenced to life in prison, and 12 were sentenced to death by hanging on October 16, 1946.
He took part in a conference between Hitler and Horthy on the deportation of Jews from Hungary and informed Horthy that the Jews must either be exterminated or taken to concentration camps.
The verdict of the tribunal rejected the popular defense offered by the defendants. The state, not individuals, could be found guilty of war crimes. They believed that they were simply following orders, and as such, were not responsible for their actions. The tribunal held that crimes of international law are committed by men, and that only by punishing individuals who commit such crimes can the provisions of international law be enforced.
Conclusion. The tribunal finds that Ribbentrop is guilty on all 4 counts.
While the Nuremberg trials restored the rights of the minorities in Axis-occupied territory, they additionally set responsibilities for governments on an international scale. The findings of the trials proceedings led directly to the United Nations Genocide Convention and Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, as well as the Geneva Convention on the Laws and Customs of War in 1949. Furthermore, it set the precedent for future tribunals for war crimes. After the Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials were held to prosecute the Japanese of war crimes, and the structure of the tribunal greatly resembled that of its predecessor. Another example is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia of 1993, which was held to prosecute Serbia for genocide and other war crimes, since the government supported a separatist Serbian movement in Bosnia-Herzegovina that practiced ethnic cleansing against Bosniaks.
These lasting impacts of the Nuremberg trials showcase that not only were they held for the just and proper restoration of human rights, but also as a blueprint that would prevent future violations by holding governments and people alike responsible for their actions.